introduce yourself, and also what title you would like.
Okay. Um, do you want me to talk to the camera or talk to you?
Whichever you prefer. Whatever you're more comfortable
Probably
with.
talk to you.
That's fine.
My name is Colin Meloy, and I am the singer and songwriter for the band The Decemberists.
And the other thing is, if you can just give me a verbal release, you know you're being filmed for Color Me Obsessed, and you're fine with the footage being used.
Okay, I know that I'm being interviewed for Color Me Obsessed, and I'm fine with the footage being used.
Beautiful. Same question I start off every interview with. Why the Replacements?
The Replacements. It goes back to growing up in Montana for me, in Helena, Montana, which is a smaller town, 23,000 people, and a couple local record stores, but this is sort of, I feel like it was prior to the prevalence of indie music, and so that only major label stuff was really available in these stores, and also there was no good radio station, no college radio station. This was certainly pre-internet. I had an uncle who went to school in Eugene, Oregon, at the University of Oregon. And starting when I was in 6th grade, so I was probably 11, he started sending my sister and I mixtapes of bands that he was discovering while he was in school. And for some reason, I think my sister was kind of like ambivalent about it, like she was into it, but it didn't really touch her. For me, it was like a lifeline, and it just immediately made sense. And particularly, I think The Replacements was a band. On the very first one, he had made me a tape of some local, like Eugene band, but at the end he tagged on a handful of songs. One was Hardly Getting Over It by Husker Du. One was Superman by R.E.M. There's a Guadalcanal Diary song on there, and then I Will Dare, and by The Replacements, and I Will Dare. As far as like a nice encapsulation of that era, it was pretty good. A collection of 4 songs, and they all, led me in directions. I immediately went out and bought Candy Apple Gray. What was it? So I got Life Search Pageant, Jamboree by Guadalcanal Diary, and Let It Be. And I think the Let It Be certainly kind of floated to the top. Even though those are all great records. And I think I Will Dare, while it's a great song, was only only hints at the greatness that is in that record, like such an amazing, weird, dynamic record. So that was my introduction, and why it connected with me, I have no idea. I think I was, preteen. I was living in Montana, feeling isolated. There's something about that music that speaks to that kind of isolation. I think the introductions that I had to punk rock and kind of junior high was like, DRI and 7 Seconds and all the music in the Circle Jerks, all the music that the skater kids listened to. And while The Replacements was fascinating to me, because not only was it was sort of beloved by certain strands of the punk kids, but it was so smart too. There was music, there was songwriting on Let It Be alone that would baffle anybody who was just like a hardcore Ramones fan, but still made sense. And so how they could jump from genre to genre, from style to style like that, and do it so well, I think was really exciting and fascinating to me.
You talk about isolation, which has been a big theme that The Replacements seem to speak to a lot of people and made them feel like they weren't alone in the world.
Yeah.
And did you find? When you got to Let It Be, and Yes, I Will There is a great pop song, but I mean, you have Unsatisfied and
Yeah.
Androgynous, and so many amazing tracks on that definitely get to.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think there's two kinds of isolation. There's like kind of a metaphorical isolation, sort of an emotional isolation that I think as a preteen growing up in Montana and starting to feel really out of place, being kind of a weird kid and being into comic books and not really playing sports and things like that. That there was definitely a feeling of isolation there, sort of social isolation among, the sort of the jocks and the ranchers that made up a lot of the junior high kids that I went to school with. And it's this really pretty small community in Montana. So there's that sort of emotional isolation that those songs spoke to. Because, I think a lot of those songs, Unsatisfied, Androgynous, these songs that are written from the perspective of the margin, certainly Androgynous, talking about, this is how people are. These are how kids can be. And so that really appealed to me. And, I mean, there's so much, kind of angsty heartbreak, Answering Machine and stuff like that, where you can really align yourself with Westerberg's, voice. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's also the geographical isolation, and there's a bunch of songs that they do. I mean, like I think of "Stuck in the Middle" off of Sorry Ma, that is literally about being stuck between the two coasts in the Midwest, and while we weren't in the Midwest, we might as well have been. We weren't in a city. We weren't. I wasn't in. It was 10 hours from Seattle, and probably 14 from Minneapolis, and so in that sense, I felt even more isolated. At least they had a major airport in Minneapolis that would take them directly to anywhere, Right. So that sort of isolation, knowing that they were from the Midwest and knowing that they were, where the winters were hard. I think there's a connection there between people who live up in the High Line and the northern states. Mm-hmm. That you kind of that it makes you can understand it. Whereas like punk rock to me felt like so metropolitan. It was from New York, it was from LA, it was from London. And seeing. Did you ever see the movie Erg: A Music War? Mm-hmm. That kind of is laid out the sort of punk new wave scene for me in a way when I first saw it, and it was definitely centered around the metropolis. So punk rock felt like it belonged to the urbanites, and not necessarily to the rural kids. It was Southern California, it was East Coast. But the Replacements were an anomaly that way. They were from this sort of semi-rural, Midwestern state, and I connected with that.
Now, where did you go from Let It Be? In terms of catalog.
I got into Let It Be. I think it was when Pleased to Meet Me was just coming out, mm-hmm. So 87. So I was definitely late to the ballgame, but I was 11, whatever. But I for some reason I went backwards. I hit up my uncle to get me some more Replacements, because there was no way you were going to find any of that twin tone stuff at the Pegasus Music at the Capitol Hill Mall in Helena, Montana. There's no way. So I think he sent me a compilation, on a tape. He sent me Hootenanny and Stink. And Hootenanny, that almost vies for my love with Let It Be.
Okay.
I think that there is people tend to criticize the Replacements as their career went on. It's a kind of, how they steadied up, and, they kind of scaled back the craziness and the shambolicness of their music. and I think that was already happening on Let It Be. Like Let It Be, I think strikes that fine balance. You know, it's not too shambolic, it's not too polished. Even though I still love their polished material for a different reason. You know, the later stuff. But with Color Me or with Hootenanny, I mean, it is just laid out. I mean, the guts that you would have to make a record like that is so impressive to me. I mean, it just felt like this was music that was made. This record was made without anybody in mind, without any audience to cater to, without any record label to appease. This was music made purely for the love of making music, regardless of the way it came out.
Right.
If it's, you know, crazy, you know, sort of shaggy punk rock, or like Stonesy rock and roll, or weird folk country jams, you know, recorded on a boombox, you know, or like a drum machine sort of love song. So Hootenanny really blew me away in ways that Let It Be kind of doesn't. I think that they're nice companions. I think of Hootenanny being kind of the bratty younger sibling of Let It Be to a certain degree, and I always really loved it for that. And Stink obviously is a nice bridge between Sorry Ma. And Sorry Ma, I think, was the last one that of that era that I got into.
Right.
And it's a little more, it's great. It's just a little bit more straightforward. I loved it just as a sort of driving around town kind of record.
It's a good car record.
Yeah,
Really
yeah, and I think that's, I'm sure they would be quick to admit that too. And then once you get there, you know, you get Sorry Ma to Let It Be. You can study this trajectory, this sort of fascinating trajectory of a band that was a punk band and in the punk scene, but obviously just could not bother to be real punk rockers, and this sort of shift towards all these other, you know, putting their toes in other genres. But what it comes down to, I think, is like just sort of gutsy records, you know, Hootenanny and Let It Be.
Now, did you then start moving forward to Tim and Pleased to Meet Me and so forth?
Yeah.
What was your feeling when the songs got, well, obviously a lot more polished, for lack of a better word?
Tim, weirdly enough, was the last one. I think I got Pleased to Meet Me after that, and I loved it, you know, and it was so much more polished, obviously, and almost like kind of a different band, but still, I mean, Can't Hardly Wait, you know, IOU, the first song that opens. I mean, those are just amazing songs, and it hit me at the right time where I was just a sponge for music, you know. And then Don't Tell a Soul, I probably listened to the least, but still has some strong. I mean, that's when Paul was sort of becoming a songwriter with a capital S, you know. And
there's a lot of good stuff about that. About talking to Matt Wallace, the producer.
Oh yeah.
We talked to him for 2 hours. We have great stuff about that album.
And that's when, I remember, because then you were seeing them on MTV, you know, even on 120 minutes, you know, and I hadn't seen any of their earlier videos, but they were obviously eschewing the whole, like, well, we'll just put a, you know, camera in front of a speaker, you know, which is so awesome. But then you know, they kind of started to pull it together a little bit more and kind of play the game, and that's fine, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, how long were they really going to be, you know, flipping off the entire industry, you know, and still trying to make a living? I mean, I kind of relate to that. And then All Shook Down, I think, was really great. It doesn't hold up for me as well over the course of time.
Actually, Paul's first album sounds better than that at this point, I think.
Yeah, even though it's always interesting to me because it was beloved when it came out.
Oh my God, the reviews were crazy.
I know, and I really loved it too. It was, but you know, going back to it, it feels like of a different era. It doesn't feel like it has much of a shelf life for some reason.
I think Rolling Stone named them Songwriter of the Year that year.
Yeah. And I think that was kind of a lifetime achievement thing happening, because I think everybody recognized that it was their last record.
Yeah.
Down to when, in the liner notes, how everybody was just kind of listed in alphabetical order.
Mm-hmm.
That was sort of, for a Replacements fan, I think that was an eye-opening experience.
Yeah.
But then I went back to Tim, and Tim is great. I mean, Tim, you can really capture that band, and it was definitely songwriting wise, and performance wise, was a definitely great jumping off point, and such great songs in there. But even as a 12-year-old, the production quality on that drove me crazy.
It's not okay, and I'm going to ask you why, because it's like every musician I pretty much talked to has said the same thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean Mac and Mac from Superchunk and Matt Gentling from the Archers of Loaf went on forever about what's your take on that? I mean,
I don't know. There's too much bad. I think maybe digital reverb slapped on it. The drums just sound terrible. Kind of cavernous, but don't have very much body. I mean, there's a lot of music being made at that time that I think that these bands who are finally on major labels, who could afford, big budget studios, Husker Du, certainly. I think Warehouse Songs and Stories, which is great, sounds like shit.
I agree with you.
I mean, the
Especially
drums are
to
so
others.
thin compared to those early ones, and those early ones just were recorded in some slapdash, garage.
Still take their single 8 Miles High has got one.
Which sounds great.
Oh my God.
Zen Arcade sounds so great. The drums, everything sounds really great. Even though I ended up John Golden, who mastered all those old SST records, would just tell stories about how Spot, the producer, would bring those records in, and they just sounded like shit, and he would do his best to polish them up.
Well, the whole thing about Don't Tell a Soul, they were trying to make a record that didn't sound like it came from any era. But Matt Wallace at that point had no track record as a producer.
Oh, really?
He was the third producer on it for some very funny reasons. Literally the first guy was fired for day one. Then they went for Scott Litt, and the next day after meeting him, they found Scott Litt duct taped to a chair in the studio. The Replacements at that point sounded as bad as they had ever been, despite the fact this is now 1989.
Wow.
Wallace was going to quit after 2 weeks, and he finally stuck with it. But they were going, he said, the album had a raw rock sound, very much like XL on Main Street was what he was going for. And they brought in the guy to mix the album, and because occasionally guitars were out of tune, it was Replacements, or instead of leaving that, he would put all these chorus effects and booming, echoes on the drum, and that big 80s drum sound. That's where that came from.
For Don't Tell a Soul.
Yeah, imagine Don't Tell a Soul with more of a raw feel, I think.
Yeah, well, I could, I think a lot of those records could stand to be remixed. I mean, so I think of the major label ones, I think people were trying to polish these things and push them in a direction that they just weren't meant to.
Pleased to Meet Me, I think, is the best sounding.
Pleased to Meet Me sounds pretty good, and that's Dickinson.
Yeah.
And even though there's some kind of big gated drums on that, it does, it kind of sticks out a little bit.
Yeah.
It is of its era. It sounds so much better than either of the records that that is around it. I mean, the fact that it made sense after a while. It was like, oh, it was Tommy Ramone, right, who produced Tim. And so you're like, oh, okay, well, they thought, we'll get this guy who, is a Ramone, and, it will give, it'll be interesting. I just assumed that he was sort of a star to work with, or an idol of theirs that they could work with, but I don't think the result. So I heard that Robin Hitchcock was considered to produce. Was he considered to produce? I think he was considered to produce Tim.
I don't know if it was. I did hear the name. I'd have to go back and check all my notes.
Yeah, Robin. Yeah. I think he was considered, and the story goes that he turned it down because he knew that they would just get way too drunk together, and they wouldn't get anything done.
Yeah. Tommy said he had to reel him in a little bit. Probably the most interesting story is Bob only played for one day.
Oh, really? On Tim?
He did every single thing on one day, and the solo on "Kiss Me on the Bus" is Tommy Ramone.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, there's definitely. I mean, I'm a big Max fan, and I'm finding out crazy stuff that I never, which is really interesting.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah. But Tommy said he actually enjoyed working with them a lot. And he's the only producer who said that.
Oh, really? Oh, so you interviewed
We talked a bunch
Tommy.
of producers. We talked to Tommy as well, and he was one of our first interviews.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
and then proceeded by a bunch of people bagging on the production sound.
The thing is, it's like I there's like I said, there's you and two other musicians have said, but I'm not gonna make it sound like. Trust me, I'm not gonna insult Tommy Ramone.
Well, you can insult Tommy Ramone. I think it sounds terrible. I think it should be remixed. Personally, especially between Let It Be, which sounds great, and it just sounds really raw and normal. Sounds like a band playing.
I think the problem for me is there's a glaze over the album. It's like it sounds like I'm always hearing it through. Muffled, there's something in my ears.
Yeah, even at the time, I think as a 12-year-old, and not even knowing what production values were, what a producer really did, I remember being like, this doesn't really sound as good. But still, the songs shine through, and that's the power of that record. That if anything of Tim is the most impressive thing is that the songs really do shine through this kind of terrible sheen of bad 80s production.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, it's just the band is sounding great, and Paul's voice sounds great, and but it just never quite clicked with me.
What? Now, so you're 12-ish at this point, give or take.
Yeah.
What was there something about the Replacements that made you eventually pick up the guitar?
Yeah.
How did that influence what you went on to do?
Well, I think it was like kind of the acoustic stuff that really grabbed me, that made me want to pick up guitar for the Replacements, because I could never figure out what he was doing on the electric guitar. Because there's some really inventive rhythm guitar play. I mean, Bobby's great, and it does. I mean, between the two of them, it's sort of it's not easy to pick it up, but there's some weird stuff going on. I think they do even some weird tunings.
Yeah, Westerberg was really into the weird tunings.
Yeah. And which is surprising. And so, like, actually sitting down and trying to figure out what they were playing, it was at least the acoustic songs, I guess Unsatisfied was a little weird tuning, but off of Boink, If Only You Were Lonely, and stuff like that, and Treatment Bound, and stuff like that. Like, for some reason, that stuff I really loved and loved, because it was really easy. Mm-hmm. So, and I was just learning to play guitar, and anything beyond 3 chords was a little challenging, but there was certainly some openings there. And I think that the kind of shambolic nature of it, it obviously, it made playing music seem more doable. You didn't have to be a studied performer. You didn't have to know your scales. You didn't really have to know chords that well, but you didn't even know how to tune your guitar that well. It could be a little out of tune, and that would be fine. And so there was that kind of approachability that they espoused. It's like anybody can do this, and I think that they were the inherent, carrying on that kind of punk ethos, that anybody can do this, and anybody should do this. This shouldn't be an exclusive thing. Rock music should be for everybody. It's the everyman music, and so that, I think, kind of screamed loud and clear to me, and made me, be brave enough to pick up the guitar and learn some songs, and even, play them at various, house parties and things like that.
Have you ever covered a Replacement song?
Now, we've done "Can't Hardly Wait." We've kind of messed around with "Color Me Impressed" in sound check. Mm-hmm. I've played "If Only You Were Lonely" like a gajillion times. Probably more. I'm trying to think. That's all I can think of right now.
So take us a little bit just on your journey. from learning, I mean, when did you, I mean, just a quick history of what you did in terms of the years of your band and so forth.
I moved to Portland, Oregon in 1999, and shortly after started playing just in not bars, not really coffee houses. Started playing open mics initially, and then started getting my own shows and playing solo, and then slowly met people through the music scene in there in Portland. And in 2001, had put together the Decemberists, and we made a little 5-song EP ourselves, and hand made the CDs and put stamps on them and sold them by mail order principally. People sending checks and things like that, and then we the local label called Hush agreed to put out our first record, Castaways and Cutouts, which was then a year later reissued by KRS, Kill Rock Stars, and we signed to Kill Rock Stars. Put out a few records, and then we signed to Capitol Records in 2006, and then been on that ever since. Put 3 records out with them.
When you were approached to write the book on Let It Be,
Tell
us a little bit about that.
Well, I think this was 2004, maybe.
That's when it came.
That's the year it came out. So 2003, I think the editor, I think his name was David, but he wrote me and asked me if I'd be interested in picking out a favorite record to write 100 pages about, and I guess for any music obsessed person, it seems like, I could totally spout 100 pages about my favorite record. So we put a list together, and kind of cobbled from my top 5 records, and we decided, and I suggested we go for Let It Be, and since nobody else had picked it, I wrote that.
Were you happy with the way it came out and everything?
I like it I like it pretty well. I mean, I feel like I would have been, I would have liked to have done more sort of investigative journalism. It'd probably been better, actually contacting the band and flying to Minneapolis and doing it more. But I decided to sort of paint their career, talk about their career and that record in particular, in the backdrop of my growing up in Montana, and how it sort of appealed to me, and was this sort of bridge through adolescence for me in this kind of isolated rural place. So that was how it was framed, and it was sort of challenging to write, and I don't think I would do it again, but it's out there.
The 100-page. I always feel that once you hit the 100-page mark, I'm always on a roll. It's like, then it's like, oh, you can't stop me. But it's like,
right, getting to 100 pages.
You have to get to 100. Yeah, that's when you know you get a book. You have a book.
Right.
It's sort of like, okay, you're in a pretty successful, I don't know if I want to call you an indie band or whatever label you want to, rock band at this point in time. Looking back at their career, do you look at them and say they really did just keep shooting themselves in the foot, i.e. Saturday Night Live and getting banned immediately? MTV is breaking bands right and left at this point. They give them the Bastards of Young video. Do you, if you can talk a little bit about that from your, because you're entrenched in the music business.
Yeah.
So it's like.
Yeah, I think that they're kind of martyrs a little bit, self-made martyrs. And while they attempted to clean up their act in the end there, I think the evidence suggests that we're all the better for it, that they continued to shoot themselves in the foot. What else, if they had done anything, that's what they were doing, that's what they were good at doing, and I think that they were creating a really necessary friction in the music industry. Because if they had just sort of gone for it and done what was expected of them, and I think there were some really high expectations of them, they would have ended up like the Goo Goo Dolls or something, and we would not remember them, in 10 years. Instead, they made their mark by, I don't know, deliberately or, just because that's what they did, compulsively fighting against what was expected of them. And that alone, I think, is more kind of inspirational than a string of number one songs and sold out arenas or whatever. In retrospect, just I think through the lens of my own career, the fact that, you hear those bootlegs from '84, I think just after Hootenanny had come out, and I remember Village Voice,
the CBGBs and the Village Voice
had called Hootenanny on the Paz and Jot poll was the number one record, and they played at CBGB's for a crowd of record execs and A&R people, and played, not only did they play covers that they didn't know, but also sang cover songs over their songs. I mean, that takes more balls, I think, than committing yourself to a career. I mean, it's just baffling how they would be able. I mean, I would be terrified, and trying to put on my best show, and impress people, and probably do a poor job because you're so nervous. They just did not give a shit, and I think that's almost like it's like an inhuman ability to do that, and that is so amazing that they were able to. And the cost to their careers, who knows? I mean, they kind of became clowns a little bit, but I think that stunt alone just proves what kind of balls they had as performers. And in that sense, while I've never done that, and I probably never will, because that's just, I don't know, that's not the kind of person I am. I think that spirit in some ways have tried to keep alive, and then I think that I'm of a generation, and I think, like John, our drummer, we're kind of the same thinking, that as a consequence of, I think, of watching the Replacements' career and what they did and how they reacted to the industry, has made us sort of more healthfully cynical about the music industry, and also suspicious about, just people's intentions, and being involved in cheesy showcases and, not really taking things that seriously. I mean, that's if there's one lesson that you can learn from the career of the Replacements, one thing that can be a positive influence on any band is to not take yourselves too seriously, and certainly don't take the industry too seriously. And there's room for you to be yourself, and there's room to fuck up. And sometimes it's better to fuck up. And having a sense of humor about this, I think people get so... I think one of the things that the Replacements were reacting against is that people just get so keyed in on this idea of having this sort of positive career and becoming a positive role model and a professional performer, that it just sort of sucked the life out of rock and roll and music, and to be able to be yourself and be a truly creative person on your own terms is something that the Replacements did very well, in a kind of a way that pushed a lot of people away, not only industry people but their fans too. Sometimes people get pissed off, I guess, about bad shows, but I think that's something that's always I've always kept in the back of my mind.
Do you think that you talk about them being a martyr? Do you think that in a way though they set the bar in the opposite direction, is you can only really go so far in terms of spitting in your fans, spitting in the face of success kind of thing?
Well, see, I watched the whole thing from the outside. I never went to, it's probably easy for me to say, because I watched their career arc, way from the outside, right, and got to sort of cheer them on. Yeah, fuck those guys in Portland, Oregon. You know, you got too wasted to play and you put on all the young fresh fellows' clothes, and that's hilarious, you know. But I wasn't one of the people who paid money and went to go see the show and felt and wanted to see a good rock band and kind of got screwed. So it's sort of easy for me to say that, and I'm sure and I've talked to people who've gone to shows, and were huge, you know, ardent fans of the Replacements, and were really bummed out, you know, because it was kind of a spit in the face of the fans to do that, you know, and not even be able to be too drunk to even put on a show. You know, people who had to scrape money together to get a ticket, you know. And so there's a balance to be struck, and in some ways, you know, they definitely went over the edge, but I think that they found that boundary. They kept stepping over it. Mm-hmm. But the fact that they found, you know, were able to go up to it, I think is sort of an impressive thing. And I hold still to this day that you know, in that relationship between performer and audience, I think the audience likes to get badgered a bit. Mm-hmm. They like a performer to kind of poke them.
Right.
And not be, you know, sort of all good attitude and respectful. I think they
didn't get that from the band.
No, I think audiences like to be punished just a little bit and kind of have a little bit of a villain on stage. I mean, if you can strike that balance, it's just like this sort of playful thing of going back and forth. Like you can create a really strong rapport with an audience if you're not just the sort of shining, beaming face, right, but actually kind of badger them a little bit. And they'll badger you back. Yeah. And as long as that's accepted, that they can badger you and you can badger them, then it's cool. And I think that the really great Replacement shows I've heard have kind of struck that line, even though they may have inadvertently been badgering the audience just by being wasted.
I think that the whole thing with Replacement shows is you had to have been part of the club where you kept going.
Yeah.
So that you never knew what you were going to get. But after 5-6 shows, you knew you were getting some kind of ride.
Yeah.
And you just had to go for whatever it was.
Yeah.
Because if it was Drunken this time, most likely next time you were going to see the greatest rock and roll band you've ever seen.
Right.
You know,
that's what I've heard too. And then I've also heard when they kind of sobered up, they would play shows and people would be yelling at them to get wasted.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that becomes the point where especially when you're by the point of like the Tom Petty tour and stuff, it's got to the point where the reputation had so preceded them.
Yeah.
You know? But when you go back to, you know, mid '80s. I mean, it was just you never knew what you're going to get.
Yeah.
But and I'm old enough to have, like, I mean, I always say it's like I saw Elvis Presley when he was thin.
Yeah.
Back in 1972 Madison Square Garden.
Uh-huh.
So, and I saw the Clash and Elvis Costello many times. You know, so I grew up with the whole punk thing. I was living in the city in '77. I mean, as great as the Clash were, I don't think there was ever a band to touch the Replacements.
Really?
Live.
Yeah.
You know. Where do you see them? And I mean, in terms of influence on all the rock and roll we've heard in the past 20 years, but where do you see them in importance in terms of an American rock band or just a rock band period?
You know, I think of them of like a truly American rock band at a time when I think that there was a lot of influence coming from England. Mm-hmm. You know, and then sort of the new wave scene. I think that I think that was something that the Brits were winning out on. And I think of them so that I think that they're kind of an interesting bridge between, you know, the Stones and you know, the Clash or something like that. Mm-hmm. The New York Dolls or something. You know, the sort of that punk ethos, but with the sort of straight up kind of American grit, mm-hmm, rock grit, even though the Stones were a British band, but they were trying to do American music. Anyway, so I think the Replacements were the American inheritors of the Stones, sort of brash rock and roll. And I know that now in retrospect. Even at the time, I hated the Rolling Stones because I hated any music that came before 1976, you know. But now I kind of recognize where all that was coming from.
Is there anything I didn't ask you about the band that you would want to say about the band to hopefully a new generation listeners?
Gosh, I don't think so. I think that's pretty well covered. You know, I don't know. I would suggest that anybody interested should just sit down and listen to Hootenanny and let it be straight through. I don't know if it would make the same sense now as it did then, but you never know. I think that it would likely translate today.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, cool.